Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into fascinating topics to get you quickly and thoroughly informed. Today, we're tackling, well, a quest as old as civilization itself, really. The
Hmm.
human dream of perfect societies. Thinkers have been, captivated by it for millennia, trying to draw up the ultimate blueprint for how we should all live together.
And two of ancient Greece's most influential philosophical minds, Plato and his brilliant student Aristotle, they certainly contributed their, let's say, profound ideas to that enduring debate. They each conceived of what they believed was the ideal state.
That's right. And you've provided us with a truly illuminating critical comparative study, along with other articles and notes that really lay out their distinct and sometimes pretty controversial visions.
Yeah, definitely controversial in parts.
So our mission today is basically to unpack these foundational ideas,
Yeah.
explore Aristotle's sharp critiques of Plato, look at Plato's own later, maybe more realistic revisions, and then finally evaluate both their models through the lens of a later critical assessment,
Hmm.
which one scholar actually called Plato's Three Shocks to Humanity.
Hmm.
So get ready for some genuine insights and maybe a few aha moments along the way.
Okay, so to really get Plato's vision, it does help to set the scene a bit. He lived through a period of, well, intense political turmoil in ancient Greece. Witnessing the rise of these extremist sophists, those traveling teachers of rhetoric and persuasion.
Yeah, often challenging traditional values, right?
Exactly. And they were seizing political positions. And then there was the terrifying rise of the mob, sort of under the guise of democracy.
And for Plato, nothing really shaped his thinking more profoundly than the execution of his own teacher, Socrates. I mean, that event just absolutely ignited Plato's deep-seated interest in politics and, crucially, its link to ethics. He became convinced that without a fundamental understanding of justice, you basically just get political chaos. His aristocratic background also kind of fed into this focus, preparing him for leadership,
Right.
even if he later stepped back from direct politics.
It's pretty clear Plato didn't philosophize just for the sake of it. His ultimate aim was always fundamentally political reform. And his definition of justice is absolutely central, like the linchpin of his entire ideal state.
Okay.
He started by sort of dismantling the common ideas about justice floating around at the time.
Right. So when Plato looked at definitions like, say, truth-telling and fidelity to agreements, or even the classic giving each his due, what was the fundamental problem he saw there? What pushed him to redefine it so radically?
Well, he argued that giving each his due could still mean, harming your enemies, which he saw as inherently unjust, just wrong.
Okay.
And he also completely rejected the sophist idea that justice is the interest of the stronger. Plato believed true rulers, like, say, doctors or artists, they act for the benefit of those they serve, not for themselves.
This makes sense.
So his groundbreaking, though, yeah, for some people pretty rigid, definition of justice is this. It exists when each individual performs his function perfectly.
Right. Doing your job, basically.
Exactly. And the state's role is to ensure this function according to natural talents and qualifications. It really boils down to mind your own business and do what you're naturally best suited for.
So this isn't just a definition. It's more like a blueprint for social harmony based on, wow, radical specialization, like a living machine almost, where every part has its perfect role.
That's a good way to put it.
And that brings us directly to the birth and structure of his ideal state. For Plato, the state arises because individuals just can't be self-sufficient,
We need
each
that,
other,
sorry.
right, for all sorts of things, material needs, other needs.
That natural need for collective assistance, that's the origin of the political community for him.
Gotcha.
And from this basic need, he proposed his famous tripartite society, a very clear division of labor. First, you've got the producers.
So farmers, artisans, laborers, the people making stuff, providing basic needs.
Precisely. Then second, you have the soldiers, or guardios, who are the protective class.
Right.
They ensure the state's security.
Okay, the defenders.
And finally, right at the top, the rulers. These are the ones he famously called the philosopher kings, or sometimes complete guardians, the wise leaders, the ones with the most complete grasp of reason.
And Plato really hammered this point home, didn't he?
Mhm.
Each class must perform its function without interfering with the others.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Switching roles, he believed, would be a grievous danger to the state, utter chaos.
He genuinely thought this strict division would create harmony and cut down on excessive individualism. What's interesting, though, you mentioned the source's note that despite how rigid this sounds,
Yeah.
his system was actually considered open in a way. It allowed for mobility based on talent and merit.
That's a crucial point. A producer's child could theoretically become a ruler if they showed the aptitude.
So not a rigid caste system based purely on birth?
No, more based on ability. And this potential for upward mobility based on merit, it brings us straight to Plato's comprehensive educational system, which is arguably the absolute cornerstone of his entire state.
Why? Because you need a way to identify and train these people.
Indeed. Its primary goal was basically to cultivate these philosopher rulers and their military assistants, the guardians. And this wasn't just, schooling as we think of it. It was a lifelong crucible designed to forge leaders.
Starting really young, right?
Yeah.
With holistic physical and moral shaping.
Exactly. And what's really striking here is Plato's uncompromising stance on censorship. The initial phase, from childhood up to around 18, focused on rigorous physical training, a very specific healthy diet, and careful psychological nurturing through refined literature and calm music. But crucially, he famously banned poets like Homer and Hesiod.
Wow, banned Homer.
Yeah, permitted only what he called educational poetry that refines the soul. And music, for him, was absolutely essential for instilling rhythm and harmony in the soul, fostering goodness.
So really controlling the inputs from a very young age.
Totally. Then came the later stages. For those who showed promise for the higher roles, young adults went through mandatory military training for 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
After that, students dove into abstract sciences, particularly mathematics. The idea was to develop abstract thinking, get them ready for philosophy.
And then the real intellectual deep dive.
Yeah.
A dedicated 5-year period just for dialectics, which is essentially philosophy itself, right? The study of pure existence, truth.
That's it. And Plato was super cautious about letting young people jump into dialectics too early. He warned they might misuse it for sophistry or just find pleasure in tearing apart arguments like a puppy.
Yeah, I can see that.
He clearly wanted mature, disciplined minds for this most important study.
And it didn't stop there, did it?
Nope. The final 15 years, from age 35 to 50, were for hands-on practical governance, serving in high offices, military command.
Real-world experience.
Exactly. Applying their theoretical knowledge, testing their resilience against, temptation as power or wealth.
It all led eventually to the philosopher king, who, after this incredibly intense lifelong education, would see governing purely as a duty for the common good. Not about seeking honor or power for themselves.
Right. But to truly achieve this kind of harmonious state, Plato envisioned some really radical social experiments, ideas that, well, even today can really spark debate, especially his theories on communism within that guardian class.
Okay, yeah. Let's get into that. First, his incredibly controversial idea that women and children should be essentially common property among the guardians.
It's jarring, isn't it? He actually believed in the equality of sexes in terms of basic capacity, even though he did also say women were generally inferior in all things, except for that basic function.
Yeah.
A bit contradictory, perhaps.
A bit. So why do this?
He saw the system as a way to kind of maximize human potential and solve social problems by completely eliminating individual family units among the guardians. Procreation was to be strictly state-regulated.
For eugenic purposes, right? To
Right.
breed the best citizens.
Exactly. Ensuring the finest kind of both sexes mate, as he put it, all for the good of the state's future stock.
Wow. And related to that was the ban on private property for the guardian class.
Yes. Producers would provide for their needs, but guardians were forbidden from owning gold, silver, houses, land, anything like that.
And his justification.
He believed owning property would corrupt them. It would distract them, make them act like traders or farmers instead of dedicated protectors, and it would inevitably lead to internal conflict over possessions. He wanted them completely, utterly devoted to the state with no private interests.
Okay. So that's Plato's pretty radical vision. And this is exactly where Aristotle, his own student, comes in with a, let's say, significant reality check.
A major reality check. While Aristotle generally agreed with the ultimate goal-state unity, he vehemently disagreed with Plato's methods. He argued they would actually harm unity, not promote it.
So Aristotle's pushback really highlights this core philosophical divide, doesn't it? Does a truly unified society come from, suppressing human nature's inclinations, as Plato seemed to suggest, or from working with them, even if they're messy, like affection and ownership, as Aristotle kind of implied? How did he specifically challenge Plato's communism?
Well, he launched a really strong critique, especially regarding women and children being held in common. Aristotle argued it would lead to conflict, like fathers desperately trying to figure out which kids were theirs,
Yeah, I can imagine.
and a general ignorance of familial bonds. He thought it would foster promiscuity and, crucially, a severe lack of mutual pair because, as he famously put it, everyone's child is no one's specific child. No one feels that intense personal responsibility.
Makes sense. It dilutes the feeling.
Exactly. He saw this as undermining two great incentives for humanity: affection and ownership. He believed these were just natural human inclinations, essential for a stable society. You can't just engineer them away.
Well, what about communal property?
Same line of argument, really. Aristotle contended it would increase, not decrease, quarrels and disputes, because who's responsible for what? Who takes care of common resources? He felt that life itself would be intolerable without private property again, seeing it as a natural human inclination.
And it wasn't just the Republic he criticized, right? He went after Plato's later work, too.
Yeah, he didn't let up. He also found Plato's later work, The Laws, to be unjust and flawed, even when Plato did start allowing marriage and some private property in that model. Aristotle still found problems with the conditions.
Okay, so having kind of dismantled Plato's grand vision, Aristotle wasn't just content to criticize. He offered his own, maybe more grounded, if less revolutionary, blueprint for an ideal state.
That's right. Though the sources do note that his ideal state perhaps lacked the warmth of creation found in Plato's, maybe partly because the whole era of independent city-states was already fading. You know, the rise of Macedonia, bigger empires. The context was changing.
Right, the ground was shifting. Still, he did articulate a vision with some key elements. What were they?
Well, for Aristotle, the ideal state size wasn't about being huge or having millions of people. It was about its ability to fulfill its function properly. It had to be self-sufficient, both in terms of area and population.
Manageable, essentially.
Pretty much. With strategic access to both land and sea for resources and defense, he specifically pointed out that really large cities are just hard to organize well.
Okay. And what are the internal components?
He detailed the essential components needed for a thriving life. You need adequate food supplies, various crafts and industries, weapons for defense, public facilities, priests for religious duties, judges for order.
The basics of a functioning society.
Exactly. And he also identified distinct roles for farmers and slaves, though maybe not as rigidly separated as Plato's classes.
And on wealth distribution, you mentioned he was more pragmatic.
Yeah, very pragmatic. He suggested learning from ancient states with long experience. And interestingly, he specifically cited Egypt as a rare example of a place he drew ideas from, which is quite unique for Aristotle.
And contrasting sharply with Plato's communal approach, Aristotle had very detailed ideas about individual marriage and family life, didn't he?
Oh, incredibly detailed. He set the ideal age for marriage at 18 for women and 37 or maybe slightly less for men. He thought the specific age gap would lead to the strongest offspring.
Wow, that precise 37.
Apparently. He even specified particular seasons for marriage, advising people to consult doctors and naturalists.
Goodness. And what about during pregnancy and after birth?
Well, he suggested mothers should avoid idleness and maybe reduce their food intake during pregnancy. And here's where Aristotle's pragmatism takes a truly, well, stark and, for us today, quite unsettling turn.
Okay.
He didn't just advise limits on the number of children, he even suggested abortion if that limit was exceeded.
Right, population control.
But then, crucially, he stated flat out that care should not be given by law to those born deformed.
Oof, that's harsh.
It really is. It reveals a kind of utilitarian mindset that prioritizes the perceived strength of the state above individual life in a very profound and frankly disturbing way for modern sensibilities.
Yeah, definitely. And his views on education, also different from Plato.
Significantly different in focus. He stressed proper nutrition, sure, but also shielding children from inappropriate sights and words, anything unfit for a free man. But the bigger point was he viewed education as a fundamental political principle.
Meaning
Its main job was to instill the specific morals and values needed to maintain the state's particular constitution, whatever that might be. And, importantly, it had to be uniform for all citizens, not left up to individual parents or whims. Education served the state.
So we've explored these two, well, magnificent yet often quite stark blueprints for society. But what does this all mean for us, looking back now? Let's turn to that critical assessment you mentioned earlier. The source concludes that ultimately neither of them really presented a truly achievable ideal state.
That's the bottom line in the assessment, yeah. And the source highlights what it calls Plato's 3 shocks to humanity. Pretty strong language.
It is. What's the first shock?
The first was his communism of women and children. The source argues this just shocked human feeling. It led to blunted parental feelings, a real lack of compassion, and fundamentally clashed with what the source sees as humanity's innate nature.
And the critique also brings in religious principles, specifically citing Islamic tenets that emphasize the family as like a core unit for life in society.
Right. For the source providing this critique, this aspect of Plato's vision was a clash with both innate nature and a religion at the same time, just fundamentally incompatible with basic human and religious structures.
Yeah. What was the second shock?
The communism of property. Plato intended for this to eliminate conflict over possessions, remember?
Yeah.
But the source argues it actually opened new doors to conflict where it sought to close them. It clashed with fundamental human demands, the desire to own things, perhaps, and again, according to this analysis, with religious principles. Specifically referencing Islamic views on private ownership, though it does acknowledge that Islam also encourages a kind of spiritual detachment from wealth.
Interesting balance there. And the third shock.
Plato's dry educational system. The source contends it kind of neglected the spiritual dimension, failed to achieve the necessary balance between soul and body, something that, again, religious teachings tend to emphasize as crucial for human well-being. It was too focused on the intellect and the state's needs, perhaps.
So this raises a really important question about justice itself, doesn't it?
Hmm.
The source argues that neither philosopher's system of justice was ultimately supreme or universally applicable.
Exactly. While Plato's idea of division of labor, doing the job you're suited for, might have some echoes of an Islamic principle related to skilled work, the source asserts that Islamic distributive justice, which it defines as based on freedom, consultation, and fair wealth distribution, stands as a lofty structure that cannot be surpassed, a higher ideal in its view.
Okay. Now, speaking of revisions, Plato himself seemed to grapple with some of these issues, didn't he? He kind of retreated to a more realistic vision in his later work, The Laws.
He did. It's often seen as his attempt at a second-best ideal state. Significantly, it's explicitly ruled by law, representing reason embodied in rules, rather than by those individual, all-wise philosopher rulers from the Republic.
So what were the key shifts in The Laws?
Well, he made some pretty big concessions. He allowed private marriage and private property, though still strictly limited and regulated.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, citizens were explicitly forbidden from engaging in industry or trade. Those activities, the sort of manual labor and commerce, were reserved for foreigners living in the state.
Huh. So citizens were landowners and political participants, but not merchants or artisans.
Pretty much. Politically, it was a mixed system, leaning towards aristocracy and heavily based on property ownership qualifications. It featured these guardians of the Constitution, 37 older members, aged 50 to 70, who were responsible for overseeing the laws.
But wasn't there also something quite severe about religion and The Laws?
Oh, absolutely. Perhaps the most jarring aspect for many modern readers is Plato's proposal for extreme state control over religion. He completely prohibited private worship or shrines. All religious activity had to be public, led by official priests.
Wow.
And most controversially, he introduced a detailed law of heresy. It targeted atheists, defining them in three ways: those who deny the existence of gods, those who deny that the gods care about humans, and those who believe the gods are easily appeased by bribes or sacrifices.
And the punishments.
They were severe, ranging from 5 years of imprisonment and indoctrination for less stubborn cases, up to death for persistent or proselytizing atheists. The source providing the critique unequivocally condemns this, calls it the first rational defense of religious persecution in Western thought and a stain on the legacy of Greek philosophy.
That's incredibly strong language. And even with this supposed emphasis on the rule of law, didn't Plato kind of sneak the philosopher-ruler back in?
In a way, yes. He introduced this body called the Nocturnal Council. It was supposed to meet at night, hence the name. This supreme body, despite all the talk about law being king, effectively acted as the mind of the state. It centralized wisdom and leadership in a select few.
So it subtly undermined the very rule of law that was supposed to define this new ideal.
Exactly. It sort of brought back the idea of the philosopher-ruler, just in a committee form, operating somewhat behind the scenes.
Okay, so that's Plato's retreat. What about Aristotle? Did he stick with his ideal state?
No, interestingly, he too ultimately seemed to conclude that his own ideal state, the one he outlined, was probably unachievable in the real world.
Huh. So what did he do?
This led him to shift his focus. Instead of pursuing the absolute perfect ideal, he started identifying the best realistic systems of government that could actually function.
And this is where his ideas become super influential for modern political thought, right?
Absolutely. He championed what he called a politia, which translates roughly as a constitutional order or polity. And crucially, he argued the best, most stable form of this politia is one where the middle class is the most numerous and holds the most power.
Well, the middle class.
He believed they avoided the arrogance of the rich and the envy or desperation of the poor. They were more likely to be guided by reason and moderation. He even cited Solon, the Athenian lawmaker, as a prime example of a great legislator who came from this middle class. Good governance, for Aristotle, really came from those who were neither too rich nor too poor.
That insight about the stabilizing role of a strong middle class feels incredibly relevant even today.
It really does. And perhaps his most enduring legacy, politically speaking, is his groundbreaking insight into the separation of powers.
Oh, yeah.
He was really the first to clearly identify three distinct branches of state power: the deliberative, which is basically the legislative assembly; the executive, meaning the rulers or magistrates; and the judicial, the courts.
That's foundational.
Totally. And he saw the legislative assembly, the deliberative part, as the true master of the state in a well-ordered system. This whole idea of separation of powers, legislative supremacy, profoundly influenced modern liberal political thought and forms, the basic structure of many democratic governments around the world today.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's fascinating. We see how both Plato and Aristotle, these giants of thought, grappled with this immense, enduring ambition to craft perfect societies. Their attempts, though maybe ultimately flawed, hitting the hard realities of human nature and social complexities, they absolutely continue to inform how we think about governance, justice, and community today.
Yeah, you really can't understand Western political thought without them. And both philosophers, in their own ways, really struggled with that tension between sort of rigid top-down ideals and the messy, unpredictable realities of human behavior. So maybe a final thought for you listening. What does the evolution and maybe the ultimate collapse of their ideal states tell you about the whole pursuit of societal perfection today?
Right. Does it suggest that true progress lies more in adapting to human nature, working with its flaws and tendencies? Or should we still be striving, like Plato perhaps, to elevate it, to push beyond our limitations towards some higher ideal?
It's the perennial question, isn't it? Adapt or elevate. A lot to think about there.